Our moderator tonight, and who will introduce our great panelists, is CNN's chief White House correspondent, Jessica Yellin. She previously served as CNN's national political correspondent, covering politics, policy, and culture. In 2010, she won a Gracie Award for her reporting on the intersection of women in politics. And prior to CNN, she was a White House correspondent for ABC News. And tonight, she's our person on the spot who's going to lead us down the path toward reconciliation and solutions. Jessica, all yours.
Oh, I'm doing the introductions. Well, we have with us a fascinating panel. To my left is Senator Corker of Tennessee, who is serving currently in the Senate and will be giving us a little bit of a guide to what will be coming after the election. Sir, are you prepared to do that? To my right, Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania, who is up for re-election this year.
Cheering section.
And has some big fans in the audience. To my far left, Governor Daniels of Indiana, who never stops making news and is frequently in the headlines this year and does not want you to ask him about whether he wants to be on the ticket. And although he'll take any question. And to my very far right is Senator/Governor/Senator Evan Bayh, also known as Dad in some audiences, but not this one. They have very long resumes, so I'm just keeping it to that. I think you all know who they are. We're talking about the major issues facing the nation, and I thought we'd start with a slide of the top concerns Americans have as we head into this election year. It won't surprise you to know that the very top concerns are jobs and the economy. Where I work, we call this in TV terms issue number one. And despite the fact that this is issue number one, it seems that Congress constantly has difficulty tackling it in our gridlocked environment. So I thought we'd start with Senator Casey, who come the day after the election, I should frame this for a moment, the day after the election, Congress will be facing the reality that the debt deal that was negotiated left a major problem. $1.2 trillion trigger is going to kick in, and unless Congress finds some spending cuts, $1.2 trillion is going to be cut out of the budget for the future, and something has to be negotiated. Senator Corker has a proposal. In 90 seconds or less, can you lay it out?
Sure. I think it's a thing that almost everybody here has heard nonstop, but I think it's a combination of pro-growth tax reforms where you lower marginal rates, broaden the base, but do away with many of the tax credits or exemptions of $1.2 trillion a year so that you actually generate more revenue tied to entitlement reform. And to me, I think everybody in the room has heard about Bowles-Simpson. They've heard all kinds of other descriptions. But to me, there is a grand bargain to be had there. And since the number one issue is the economy and should be, that so much ties to putting some wind at our back as a nation. I mean, the fact is we have tremendous self-doubt. People are wondering whether these issues are going to be dealt with, this structural deficit. And I think the very best thing we could do for our economy is to actually deal with it in this fashion. I think the lame duck is an excellent opportunity for that to happen.
Senator Casey, the odds that this actually gets passed?
Well, it's hard to tell, but Bob has made some good points, and he's been very thoughtful about this. We're going to face a couple of deadlines or a couple of challenges. Number one is going to be by the end of the year, the tax decisions we have to make. I would hope we could do something more substantial than that, but we may be limited. But I think Bob makes a point that even though the main focus is on job creation, and that will persist, I think that will continue, giving people a sense either that we have the ability to come together on a deal, which I think is less likely, maybe a lot less likely, but even absent a kind of a grand bargain, even a pathway or a well-articulated sense that we can get there in a short period of time after the year ends would help enormously. But it may come down to a basic decision about making the cuts to avoid sequester, or having some vehicle where you delay that decision and try to reach a consensus. My only difference with Bob's formulation on tax reform is I think there's broad-based agreement on tax reform. The elements of it, the component parts of it, we might have some disagreement about, but there is great consensus on it. There's even consensus, I think, between the two parties with regard to lowering the corporate rate. And my main concern will be, in addition to pushing for a consensus, to make sure that we don't do anything that slows down near-term job creation. That's why I think getting the payroll tax cut done this year, having other measures like that kickstart short-term and intermediate-term job creation, even as you're working on longer-term deficit and debt reduction.
Senator Bayh, since you're free now, you can answer truthfully.
The most dangerous man in Washington, I can tell you exactly what I think.
Hard to say were the first words out of Senator Casey's mouth when I said, could Senator Corker's bill pass? Could a comprehensive grand bargain pass that takes on tax reform, entitlement reform, and a true grand bargain?
Well, it can, but I think it's going to take a crisis before that happens. And the reason for that is that there are three important players in all this who aren't represented on the panel here tonight. We've got two very reasonable Republicans. We have two, what I hope are very reasonable Democrats. But we don't have a Tea Party representative, and we don't have an Occupy Wall Street person, and we don't have a member of the House of Representatives, which tends to be a little more polarized in the United States Senate. So I personally think what will probably happen, I love my friend Bob Corker. If we had 100 Bob Corkers, 99 Bob Corkers and Bob Casey, we'd get a lot more done in the Senate. But I do think in the lame duck, it's just going to be hard. You looked at the failure of the super committee last August, and so on the heels of a bitterly fought, negative, divisive election, to expect this group of people, some of whom are lame ducks, to resolve taxes, spending, and the debt ceiling, boy, before the new year, with Thanksgiving and Christmas thrown in there, I think that's a heavy lift. So I personally think the most likely path will be that it will get put off for 3 to 6 months. Some principled people, like Bob, will say, wait a minute, we can't pass the buck here. But that is the path of least resistance, so you probably get a majority of that, and then allow the next president and the next Congress to deal with this. The key thing to focus on is the debt ceiling. You know, for some people, putting off raising taxes, well, that's an easy vote. Putting off draconian cuts to defense, that's an easier vote. No one wants to vote to raise $1 trillion in debt. I mean, most members would rather have their arm cut off than do that. But you can't let the country default. And so eventually that's going to have to be addressed. I think what you'll see is a lot of brinksmanship, like we had in August. But I think this time you'll get the job done because, unlike in August, you do have the debt ceiling. You didn't have that automatic. The cuts were going to go into effect, but it wasn't in August. It was next January. So I would put the odds at 51% that eventually a grand bargain like you've described will happen, but there'll be a lot of fluctuation in the markets, a lot of wringing of hands about, is the United States going to default?
Eventually, sometime next year? Sometime in the next 5
years?
years?
After the 3 or 6 month extension, whatever it is, I would think after a lot of wringing of hands, a lot of brinksmanship, a lot of ups and downs in the marketplace, eventually there will be a grand bargain. But
whether a Democrat or a
optimism,
Republican's elected.
Yeah, either way, this problem has to be solved. And again, maybe I'm being a little, I thought it was going to be solved last August. So the difference now, though, is you do have the debt ceiling vote that no one is going to want to cast. And so I think as a part of a bargain that's going to have enough people vote to raise the debt ceiling, you're going to have entitlement reform. You're going to have tax reform. Some of these other things that people can say, well, I didn't just vote to borrow a bunch of money. I voted for these other things that will actually help to grow the economy and in the long run, slow the thing down.
Governor Daniels, you have been a true leader on this issue. You've led by example. And last year you said in a speech that got a huge amount of notice, you called the debt the nation's new red menace. Fighting it is a generational duty. Senator Bayh has just said that the debt limit is the thing we have to focus on. I'm curious if you agree with your party's position that for every dollar spent to raise the debt limit, the Congress must slash $1 of spending. And if so, how do you propose finding that money the next time the debt limit has to be raised?
Well, first let me say that although I think Evan's right in saying it'll take a crisis to force action in Washington, which would seem very conventional, by the way, in 50 states of this country, almost all of whom have done things at least as dramatic as as what we really need Washington to do now. I think what's less well understood is we're in that crisis right now. Arithmetically, we are. And if you wait until there is a visible catastrophe, we will be well past the point where we can recover economically and restore or rebuild the promise of upward mobility that we've always associated with this country. So, you know, I don't dispute that it may take that long and may take that combination of circumstances for Washington to act, but it'll be a sad day if it comes to that. You know, I don't have I'm not fixed on any one formula. I believe that Senator Corker has laid out the right way forward. We've got to have much faster growth in this country. People who disagree about everything else should agree with that and should agree to take every impediment possible, regulatory and other, out of the way of faster growth. If you believe in a giant government like the one we have, you have a bigger stake in that than anyone. Yes, there's no credible plan for the future of this country economically that doesn't start with and include real entitlement reform. So you say the position of my party, I'm not sure what it is right now, but I hope our presidential nominee will place this at the center of his agenda and will indicate a constructive plan for moving forward in a big way against our debt burdens, but also an openness to second or third choices if it comes to it.
Well, do you think if Romney is elected, he'll have a mandate to reform for entitlement reform? Because to date, he has not made it a centerpiece of his campaign.
Depends how he campaigns. I believe he should campaign to govern and not just to win the election. That means lay out a plan like Bob Corker's or some variation of it. Trust the American people. You know, level with them about the facts. You know, I don't think our politicians on either side give the American people enough credit on most occasions these days. And Americans sense, even if they don't know all the data about it, that we're in a heck of a fix here. And I believe that the best campaign, both politically and responsibly, if you want to solve these kind of problems, is one that takes the chance that you can lay these things out specifically. And having won on that basis, you have a fighting chance to assemble a coalition for real change.
And can I just pin you down again on that first question I asked? Do you believe for $1 the debt limit is raised, $1 in spending has to be cut?
I'd cut more than that, honestly. I mean, we have a spending problem that's you know, grotesque in this country.
Can some of it come from revenue?
Well, you know, the question I thought you were going to ask, and I think a very legitimate one, is the one that was asked in one of those debates, which I confess I didn't watch 1 minute of any of them, but I read about it. The 10-to-1 question.
Yes.
That's a good question. And somebody should have raised his hand.
I agree.
Somebody should have said, not necessarily, yeah, I'll take it, but somebody should have said, tell me more. Are these spending reductions real this time, or is it more, are they bogus, as they have been in the past? And on this on the revenue front, what kind of revenue you got in mind? If it's marginal rate increases, you know, or capital gains increases, or things that lean against investment and growth, no, because they're dumb and counterproductive. But there are other ways, you know, talk to me about what kind of revenue you plan to raise, and if that's the only way to get a deal.
Let me just,
Yeah.
you know, the way the math works is if you raise the debt ceiling by $2 trillion and you make $2 trillion in cuts over the next decade, believe it or not, in 10 years you have a balanced budget. Just do the math. It works out that way. So, you know, I think Speaker Boehner, by accident, made a comment in New York along those lines about the formula. Somebody did the math and realized, hey, this might really work. I mean, if you did this in 10 years, we'd have a balanced budget. But I think what you have to look at is Washington does a really terrible job with discretionary caps. I mean, the fact that the super committee couldn't come up with $1.2 trillion in cuts when you're going to spend $44 trillion over the next 10 years, I mean, It's almost unbelievable that you couldn't do that. But I think what you have to do is match up the qualitative pieces of it, okay? In other words, I would actually take entitlement reform over cuts in discretionary spending over the next 10 years, because you only do entitlement reform every 15 or 20 years, and it sticks, and it becomes reality. And so some of the changes, spending-wise, with entitlement reform might not take place until the second decade, but they actually would have a much greater impact on our ability as a country to be solvent. So I think you have to look at the qualitative pieces of it also.
Senator Casey, do you think that, given where Senator Corker stands on these issues, that there's a likelihood that you can find a bipartisan consensus even after this year? Let's say it doesn't happen in lame duck, that there can be some kind of entitlement reform next year.
I don't know, I'm not going to predict, but I will say this, that part of this isn't just getting, or I should say a good part of this isn't just getting some kind of policy formulation that makes sense. That's obviously central to it. But you've got to have folks that are willing to come together in ways that you haven't seen recently. And that means surrendering, and not just a point of view once in a while, but that means surrendering some of the poison that we see, where people on both sides inject poison into the debate. They make categorical judgments like all we need to do is one thing versus the other. I mean, everyone knows, if you're credible, that we were at a point in 2000 where, if you look at the whole pie, and you look at federal government revenue and federal government spending, that we had the balance right. We had basically 1918, revenue 19, at that time spending was 18. Under Ronald Reagan, revenue was 18%, and now we have it all out of whack. We are spending too much. We're at 24, and just getting it down to 20 would be a tremendous challenge. We also have a revenue number which is maybe just a hair above 15%, when it had been 18 under Reagan and 19 under Clinton. So getting that balance is going to be difficult. Both parties actually have a point to make. When one side says we're spending too much, we are. And the other side says we don't have enough revenue to make it work, we don't either. And I think the more people can concentrate on that balance, the better. But along the way, we've got to stop demonizing, being categorical, and trying to find a space where you can work together with people to get a conclusion. But look, this is very, very difficult.
Have Democrats contributed to that problem?
Sure.
How?
Well, I think you've seen on both sides some of that kind of poison in the debate, and it's the number one issue that I hear about in Pennsylvania. People, I know you had...
Bob's running you, Jessica. Why don't I answer that question?
Yeah.
Well, let me just finish. In Pennsylvania, I saw the polling you just showed about jobs and the economy, and I'm not going to dispute
Maybe
your
the
pollster.
Buffett rule?
The number one issue in my state, substantively you might say it's jobs, but the number one issue that people talk to me about, left, right, and middle, is you guys got to work something out. I've got to work with people I don't like working with, or I've got to make decisions as a citizen that I don't like. You guys have to do the same thing. I hear about that everywhere, even to the exclusion of the economy.
I'd say three things. I think Mitch was exactly right. The two big drivers of the budget deficits, if you look out 10, 20 years, number one, growth. We've got to look at ways to grow this economy to generate not only jobs and prosperity for people, but the revenue that then kicks off for the government. And too often, members of our party look at the bottom line, the revenue they want, without thinking about the implications for growth. So we've got to be for sensible, pro-growth tax reform. That's number one. That does have the consequence of generating more money to help solve the deficit. And we need to dedicate it to getting down the deficit, not just putting it over to discretionary spending and that sort of thing. But the other item is, and it's going to be very interesting to see what the Supreme Court does in June, the other big driver of the budget deficit are health care costs. Medicare and Medicaid are eating us alive over the next 15 to to 20 years. So depending on what the court decides, perhaps that will put that issue back on the agenda. And members of my party, members of the Republican Party, need to be willing to accept a deal that Ronald Reagan accepted, which was some additional revenue in exchange for spending restraint and entitlement reform. The conservative government in the UK has accepted a 75 to 25 ratio. So deep in their hearts, all those people who said no, not even a 9-to-1 ratio, had to know that if they're going to govern effectively, that's not possible. And members on our side of the aisle who say, look, you can't alter one iota of any entitlement and just take that completely off the table, are equally unreasonable, because at the end of the day, what you get is what's going on in some of the countries in Europe. If both parties are intransigent, if there's not a principled compromise, you get both tax increases and entitlement cuts. That's the ultimate destination for the extremes on both sides. They both get what they don't want.
Let me ask you on taxes, Senator Bayh. Nobel Prize-winning economist Peter Diamond and Berkeley professor Emmanuel Saez have done a study estimating that the U.S. can increase taxes on top earners 50 to 70%, to 50 to 70% rate before it has an adverse impact on economic growth. And this has been published in the Wall Street Journal. It's been in the New York Times. Everybody here probably knows it, has read it, maybe doesn't like it.
I've got 2 kids who are applying to college. What universities were those?
They didn't do too badly, these
No,
two. Yeah. And they've studied, they did
Actually,
this.
my wife's a Cal alum, so I better watch what I say about Berkeley.
They did
But,
this, and it was a study of the post-war years, and they found that actually when there was a higher tax rate, there was more growth. So, as we know, many Republicans have taken a no tax, higher taxes pledge. How have Democrats managed to lose on this issue despite the evidence in history and a Nobel Prize winning economist on their side?
Well, first, let me express, I've not read the study, so I can't make an intelligent comment on that. But my guess is that if high marginal tax rates didn't impact growth, now that's not all there is to it. Regulatory policy matters, labor market flexibility matters. There are a whole lot of things that matter, but you know, my guess is that the growth rates in Western Europe would be a lot higher today than they are if, you know, the tax rates didn't have some impact. And just what I hear anecdotally about capital leaving places would lead me to believe that I would have some skepticism about the study. So let me just say that. But the other thing, the real hard, and as governor, I had to deal with this. Mitch has had to deal with this too. We have local, at least back in the day, we had local property tax referendums. We have property tax caps in Indiana, but you could have a local referendum to raise the caps. And the polls would usually indicate, for local schools, the polls would usually indicate that, yeah, people would be willing to pay higher property taxes if it went to the local schools. These things always got defeated. So I took an interest in this, and we did some polling, and then I saw some at the national level. Here's a question. Patty Murray, a few years ago, was making a presentation that I saw, big poll, different news organization. They asked 3,000 Americans, out of every dollar that you send to the federal government in taxes, how many cents do you believe are wasted? Well, some people said 100 and some people said 0. But the average, 42 cents on the dollar. That's where we lose the tax argument, because even people who are willing to pony up more in taxes to improve local schools, to provide better health care, to build infrastructure, if they think that more than 40% of it is going down the tubes, they're who would want to give to a charity or any other worthy cause if you thought they were wasting 40% of your money? I personally think that figure is way high for a variety of reasons. But if that's the perception, we as Democrats have to deal with accountability for results, measuring outcomes, not just inputs. If you're going to give us $1 more of your hard-earned money, here's what you're going to get for it. That's where we lose the battle on taxes.
I agree.
Do either of you gentlemen think that your party is too intransigent on taxes?
Look, first of all, we have the most progressive tax system in the OECD countries. There's 28 countries. We have the most, not Sweden, right? Not the UK, not anywhere else, United States. So you can say, well, it's still not good enough. We want to squeeze more. If you want more contribution, and that's fine, we're all going to have to contribute. Everybody in this room should be first in line to solve this massive problem we have, but that's the wrong way to do it. Bob's got the right way. We should flatten and neutralize the tax code to the maximum extent possible, and wealthier people will naturally, they've done it every time. I was in the '86 tax reform campaign, and it proved out beyond its expectations. The growth will generate more revenues, and a higher percentage of them will be paid by wealthy people, if that's what makes you feel good. The second place to look is the means testing of entitlements. Nobody in this room needs a Social Security check, I'd wager to say, and would be probably be glad to tender it. Ditto for health care or most of that. So those are the two. What's the plural of sine qua non? I don't know, my Latin's not good enough.
Yeah. So,
You know, and I think our party should be prepared to lead on these questions. I think it's consistent with Republican philosophy. I do want to say one other thing, though. I don't think we should get wrapped around the axle on either side about these ratios. You know, when it's all done, if we had a lower, flatter tax rate system in this country, one more conducive to growth, a secondary question could be, where do you set the rates? We're an aging society. And yes, we've gotten by on a certain percentage of GDP in the past, but I just don't know that's, you know, chiseled in the limestone of the Capitol anywhere. We may have to live with a little more than 20% for a while, but we don't have a chance of getting there if we don't grow this economy faster, and that will require a dramatically different set of regulatory and other policies at the federal level.
the reason I don't think we're too fixed on the issue is I really believe, just as the two former governors have mentioned, if people believe that we've done the things we need to do to reform entitlements and to really bring down spending over the long haul, to do away with our unfunded liabilities, I believe that Republicans in the majority will vote to do the type of tax reform that we've been talking about that generates more revenue. So I don't think so. I think it has been. One party's been talking about, I mean, if you look at the president's budget, I mean, it's more of the same forever. On the Republican side, I think you saw Paul Ryan lay out tax reform. Now, he hasn't gotten into the details. My sense is, and let me say this, I'm going to write a bill, and it's going to be ready before September 1st that lays out the details, because let's face it, the reason Bowles-Simpson was so popular, all the details were left out, and the details are what divide. There's no questions. And so, you know, to be serious about it, you've got to lay out exactly what deductions you're going to get rid of. And by the way, the health care exclusion that many of you benefit from is one of the biggest drivers. You've got the home mortgage deduction, you've got charitable contributions, but you've got to lay those out so that people know what proposal you're laying out is, what the reality of it is. And I think, again, it's got to be tied to entitlement reform. If you do that, I think you're going to see the majority of Republicans get behind a bill like that. And I think we can get the majority of Democrats to do the same.
Will your defense cuts be as high as Bowles-Simpson, which were much higher than what's in the trigger, and already that's causing outrage in Capitol?
Well, now we've already been through a big round of defense
But
cuts.
there's more to come, and Panetta's asked for those to be rolled back.
Well, no, the defense cuts that are coming were purposely painful because they were part of the sequestration process. And I think people on both sides of the aisle think the sequestration process that's been put in place is not realistic. So we have to come up with $1.2 trillion in other kinds of cuts, or have them ratioed in a little bit different way prior to the time they take place. And on the defense side, the Defense Department is already making reductions because they can't just turn on a dime. I mean, they're ordering ships, they're ordering airplanes, they're ordering other kinds of things, and the fact is, this kicks in on January 1st. I think we'll find a different solution than the sequestration that was put in place. But again, it's pretty mind-boggling that 12 people couldn't come up with $1.2 trillion in reductions.
The super committee.
It's pretty unbelievable, and that's why we find ourselves in the place we're in.
It probably wouldn't have passed anyway if they had, but that's just
No, I
my
think it would have.
prediction.
I think it would have.
You do? Okay.
I do.
Yes.
Let me just add something to that. The outcome of the Supreme Court case on health care is going to have an impact on all of this, because you can't even begin a discussion about deficit and debt reduction unless you're serious about controlling health care costs without some vehicle to do that. Now, some would say that the health care legislation didn't do enough, but if you take that off the table and you have no consensus about a health care policy or strategy going forward, it makes it very difficult to reach an agreement.
Well, let's posit that the Supreme Court overturns the mandate. And let's say we get a divided Congress next year, do you envision some kind of health care legislation could be passed again?
I think it'd be very hard. It took, depending on how you count it, years or decades to get something passed. So I think it's very difficult. And I think there's an economic consequence, because if the economics don't work, if the court strikes down the mandate, the act, I think, in my judgment, collapses. So you're left with nothing. Look, even if they uphold it, it's going to be a challenge, because we still have to implement it the right way. You still got to bring the country together. And my theory is that my side of this argument has a much tougher road, no matter what the court does.
Why?
Jessica, healthcare costs will go up a lot faster if that law takes effect than if nothing happens. Healthcare costs are moderating in this country. You all just read it this week. They're down to 4% growth. Everybody seems surprised, but they shouldn't be, because the market has been, despite a lot of obstacles put in its path, has been crab walking toward high deductible plans and greater personal involvement in first dollar cost of health care. We have a lot of experience with this in Indiana. 92% of our state employees, we're the only state like this, have an HSA plan. Our health care costs are double digits below call it the control group. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that we're all good consumers when we're asked to be. And so I'm in favor of health care reform. I'd start where Bob does, with some limitation at least on the deductibility, the way we do it now. But if you put me to a choice between the Obamacare bill, which we all know now is going to lead to dramatic increases in both government spending and health care costs, versus the status quo, I'll take the status quo at plus 4% and maybe less if we allow consumerism to spread.
Senator Bayh, is the status quo reasonable?
The status quo with the health care bill, or assuming the health care bill has been struck down?
Struck down.
Well, the news this last week about the growth of health care costs, if sustained, is definitely good and would be a game changer. But I go back, I'm getting so old now, I go back to the first time when we created managed care and that sort of thing in the early 90s, and what you had was a 2 or 3 year period where health care costs slowed, but then they pretty quickly ramped back up to double digits. So we need to wait and see whether this good news is sustainable over a longer period of time or not. So, look, we're going to have to grapple with this issue. The health care bill was largely a coverage bill for the 35 million Americans without coverage, and an insurance reform vehicle. There were about 8 different pilot programs in there that over 10 years would give you some insights about how to constrain costs, but ironically, it really didn't address the single thing that most Americans care about, and that's the rising cost of their health insurance. I hope Mitch is right, and I personally believe in a more market-based competitive model to trying to get costs down, but I guess my experience tells me that we'll be lucky if that's the case, that costs may once again revert to a higher growth path, and something will have to be done. Yeah. So the status quo under that circumstance would not be acceptable.
I think that prior to this bill passing, there was a lot of common ground regarding the kinds of things that really drive towards markets reducing costs. I think now that the bill is passed, healthcare, candidly, the well is poisoned. And I think if the bill is
politically,
it's poisoned, because what's happened, the debate has now moved people further apart than where they were. I mean, people, I think, were willing to offer some real solutions on both sides of the aisle. Now the debate is just totally poisoned, and I think if this bill if the Supreme Court says it's unconstitutional in some way that ends it, I think it's going to be a good while before we get back to health care reform. And candidly, the bigger issue right now is dealing with the issues we've been talking about. And I think Mitch is right, and I think most people in the audience, regardless of which side of the aisle they're on, realize that over the next decade, with this bill in place, our nation is going to be facing higher costs, because in a free market society, people seek their own self-interest. And if you look at this bill, people making up to $88,000 a year get a subsidy. The employer can pay a $2,000 penalty and move their employee out on this public exchange. This bill is going to cost at least twice as much as has been laid out, because people are going to move their employees out to the public exchange. They're going to take up on this subsidy far more than anything that's been anticipated. And so I agree. I mean, the cost is going to be far greater.
And what do you do about the problem of the unemployed?
Well, the-
Uninsured.
Well, I really think that prior to this bill becoming law, there were a lot of things about monetizing the exclusion that takes place to create credits, real money. I'm not talking about something that you file at the end of the year. There was a lot of take-up on that issue in the Senate. And so, again, I don't think Republicans are going to be ready to sort of jump back in that fray. I'm just being 100% honest, just because of the way this has been poisoned. But those are the kind of things that I think ought to happen. The exchanges are actually not a bad idea. I mean, to create a competitive marketplace in each state where people can, choose from differing health plans, like we do, by the way, at the federal level, that's a great idea. But the way this was constructed, it's so rich, that it's going to have to be changed. And candidly, I don't know many people that have focused a great deal on health care in the United States Senate that really believe, on either side of the aisle, that believe this bill can work as it was passed. I don't think people think the projections are realistic, and I think they know we're going to have to revisit this because it's far too rich and is going to break our nation.
Okay, we're in an election year, so let's talk politics for a minute. Senator Casey, Joe Manchin, as another senator, he's a Democrat up for re-election from West Virginia. He said he's not sure if he'll vote for President Obama. He said that the last 3 years have, quote, made it pretty rough for his state, and when it comes to the president, quote, I'll look at the options. Do you plan to vote for President Obama?
Yes.
Will you campaign for him in your state?
Yes, we'll be on the same ticket, and we'll be campaigning together.
Do you think it was inappropriate for Senator Manchin to say that?
There's an old rule in the Senate where you don't give advice and you reject any that you get from a fellow senator. No, I'm only kidding. But no, Joe's, he's got to make his own decision about that.
The president's team is going to be fighting hard for Pennsylvania. It's considered something of a battleground. You think they'll win it, and why is it such a hard
I think the president will
fight?
carry the state, but it won't be easy.
Why is it hard to fight for him?
Well, because it's a barely blue state. It's been reliably blue for the last 5 presidential elections, but not by much. The last race was a bigger margin than anyone would have expected, but prior to that, it was a 51-49 state, and I think it'll be closer to that this time.
Senator Bayh, may I ask you the same question? Will you vote for President Obama?
Yes.
Will you campaign for him?
I think the best outcome is to have the president working with both parties in Congress to try and get things done. I think but the problem we have here is not that we've got, one president or another of a different party, but our politics has become so polarized and partisan, and increasingly Americans are identifying themselves as liberals or conservatives, Democrats or Republicans, rather than Americans first. The greatest generation coming through the Great Depression and the Second World War realized we couldn't take what we have in this country for granted, and increasingly we're getting away from that. And before we came on here, we were talking about the problems in Afghanistan and so forth. And thank God, in this country, it's not quite so bad as what they have there, whether they're, Sunnis or Shia or Pashtuns or Uzbeks or Tajiks. But this polarization has got to stop. The final thing I'd say is, so yes, but the president needs to reach out and work with members of the loyal opposition, because the quote I'll leave you with, it was a civil rights leader who once said, we may have arrived on these shores in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. It's about time we started remembering that, a common heritage and a common destiny, and we're all going to go down together if we don't start working on it.
Would you ever run as the candidate for a viable third party?
A viable third party? Mm-hmm. I don't think there is such a thing at this point.
If there were, would you?
Well, I'm sorry, our time is about up here. Well, I was privileged to be considered the last time as a possible running mate, and I guess it came down to a coin flip, and I kind of think I won the coin flip. I love what I'm doing now, so I'm happy with what I'm doing.
Nice politician answer.
But thank you for asking.
Okay.
It's good for my ego.
I know this has been a popular topic. Who will be Governor Romney's running mate? He said that he's considering at least 20 names. So I'm curious, if you were asked to submit papers to be vetted, would you accept, and I'll put the question to you, Senator Corker.
Well, I will answer the question if I'm ever asked to be vetted. It's really. I think Mitch has a real possibility of that, by the way, and you ought to focus on him. But, you know, all of this discussion about what your answer would be, it's really amazing to hear people give their responses. The fact is, nobody knows what their response would be until they were asked. And I think until we know who's asked, I think
Well,
we ought
I'm
to stay
asking.
Yeah, well, I'd be glad to be your running mate. I really would.
I'm for Corker.
Well, you know, Tennessee senators, you know, when running with former governors have had some success.
They have. Tennessee's had some great senators, and I hope over the time that I'm there to rise to the level of people who've come before me.
Okay. Governor Daniels, you're sick of being asked, so I'm not going to ask you. You've answered.
I'm not making this up. I was reading the New Yorker magazine on the airplane coming
Yeah.
out here, and Courtney Love's psychic said I was the most likely, so I think that pretty much settles it.
Said you're the most likely?
April 16th issue, yeah, I don't know.
You got to believe that Mitch is on the short list. So
Thank you, no.
Governor Daniels, as an outsider watching the race, what advice would you give to Romney beyond? I know you've said that you want him to make it substantive and issues focused, but
Well, yes, but very much as part of that, let me go back to something Evan just said. I mean, I've said every chance I got, I think, I wish both parties, but it's going to have to be ours this time around, I think, have got to eschew divisiveness and speak the language of unity about this country. And the issue we started on tonight is the best place I know to start. You know, whatever your politics, whatever your ideology, the debts we have piled up and the slow growth which is contributing to that are a threat to us all. And we ought to react the way we always have when we've had a common threat, and that is to unify and to set aside other things, issues that sincerely divide us, social questions and so forth, at least temporarily. And the very formulas that every one of these fellows has talked about, there ought to be the elements for agreement there. And I hope for a campaign this fall that invites any American who wants to see that problem solved to should be welcome to that campaign. And it's going to have to be Governor Romney's. And that's what I meant when I was talking about a campaign that aims not merely to win an election, but to assemble a governing coalition. Look, I come from a state, Evan can, I think, validate this, that has, throughout its history, has never been known as a vanguard state in terms of advancing change first. We've made a heck of a lot of it in the last 7 years. And we have learned that to make big change, you need big majorities. And you need to try to assemble together around big goals people who might not otherwise get in the same room with each other or might disagree about other things. That's the kind of campaign I hope and believe Governor Romney's going to run.
But you know that those kinds of campaigns don't often succeed. What history has shown us is that negative campaigning works. Nobody likes it, but that seems to be what works nationally.
You know, fire those guys. I mean,
Yeah.
we never hired one. It's like, you know, these people who want to navigate somebody said that, you know, most politicians operate by sonar, but occasionally, and it was said of Churchill, Manchester wrote about Churchill, he had his own gyroscope. He didn't send out little pings and listen to what came back and then change direction based on that, right? And, you know, polls change all the time, and they often change in reaction to leadership and to people hearing facts or hearing arguments that they hadn't been presented before. And the guys on this panel, I guarantee you, they never took polls to figure out what they thought. If the polls indicated the public had a different view, they tried to deal with that and perhaps move it over time. And that's what we're going to need. And I don't believe for a minute that it requires negative campaigning. You know, there aren't very many Americans left who haven't come to some judgment about President Obama. They either like him and believe he's done a good job or not. And I just don't think Governor Romney should waste much time talking about the president. He should talk about the presidency that could be.
And I don't think there are many Americans that believe that the formula we have in place, which by the way has been going on for a long time. I mean, what's happened in Western democracies is that politicians have given citizens what they wish without asking them to pay for it. And both sides have been okay with that equation, and now, let's face it, that gig is up. And people know that that formula has to change. I mean, we're involved in generational theft. We are involved right now in generational theft. What I hope Governor Romney will do is appeal to the strength of America. Look, our founders came up with this life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness as part of our Declaration. Nothing makes people happier than earned success. I mean, look at the people in this room. What makes people happy is earned success, and I hope what he'll do is champion our free enterprise system, which has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty around the world as they've tried to emulate us. And he will appeal to the greater angels of this nation and lay out, as Mitch, I agree with Mitch, he needs to lay out exactly how we're going to deal with this issue. This is the biggest issue we face as a nation, and we can deal with it so simply. I mean, it's like almost one piece of legislation, and then all of us, Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, can get on with the work of doing the things that many of you are doing at this conference, and that is focusing on how we make this great nation even greater. We're involved in self-doubt right now, and we need to move beyond that. And I hope that Governor Romney will run a campaign that takes us beyond that and takes our nation to a place that we need to be.
Can I just append one or two sentences? Yeah, one or two sentences to that?
Yes, please.
I think this thing we've just been talking about is the second biggest issue we're facing. The biggest issue is, are we still a self-governing people? Are we still people capable of self-governance and of making the mature decisions that a democracy has to make? And whether we do what's been discussed here, whether we wrestle successfully, whether you can speak openly and plainly, specifically to the American people about the fix we're in and the ways to improve it, will tell us whether, this of and by the people adventure of ours can long endure.
Would you like a Democratic
Yes,
perspective on running?
like enough. Turning this way.
Let me see, as a Democrat evaluating Governor Romney's process for selecting a vice presidential candidate, I think I'm duty-bound to say that I hope that the rancor and discord of the primary continues unabated. No, if I were advising anyone making that decision, I think too much has been made in the political chatter about, I think this goes for both parties. It was a decision in 2008 for Barack Obama, and now it's a decision for Mitt Romney. But too much is made of the electoral calculation. If you pick so-and-so, they give you 2 points or one. I don't know a politician that can add a point or two. Maybe someone can disprove that, but I think it should be, the first determination should be, can this person serve as president credibly and with integrity on day one? Number two for me would be, will they be loyal and not, splash off the side of the boat when things get rough. But I think far too much, if you make the decision based upon electoral calculations, as some assume, I think one of those other more important factors are going to be a problem for you.
I wonder.
If you look at Bill Clinton, he picked a guy, he violated all the rules. Picked a guy his age, from his region, same religion, and there are a lot of similarities, but he picked someone who would be not just capable, but compatible.
I wonder what your critique, though, of the president's campaign, they were critiquing their own party, might be right now. He's come out with 3 ads to date, two English language ads. Both have been in some way attack ads or negative ads. Today's ad, I think it was today, was called Swiss Bank Account, attacking Mitt Romney for having a Swiss bank account. None has been a positive ad defining his own agenda yet. He has yet to define what he would do really in a second term, except he has said if health care is overturned, I'll push for health care reform again. He said he'd push for immigration reform.
Well, I think it's early. If you look at the spending, I just saw a graph recently. Look at the spending on in the Obama campaign so far. Most of it, I think it was in excess of $25 million, was spent on things other than ads. So I think the ad buying is very limited, and by the end of this, you're going to see positive ads. You're going to see on both sides. You're going to see negative ads, or as James Carville once called them, factual comparatives. But you're going to see a lot of that. The factor we haven't talked about much yet, which is going to be a substantial factor, and maybe a decisive factor, is the super PACs.
Yeah, super PAC.
And I think some people who voted against disclosure for those kinds of entities might have a different opinion now, because I think they've already had a very damaging effect on the Republican presidential, the primary. I think Governor Romney's negatives, some of his negatives, high negatives, can be attributable to the advent and the proliferation and the destructive capacity of those super PACs.
Senator, we can talk more about super PACs, but I'd love to ask you about a race that's happening in your state. Senator Luke.
I thought you were going to ask me about a home state candidate for vice president. I think it'd be great. Reminds me of something, Mitch, I was on Meet the Press with Phil Gramm once, and Tim Russert asked me, he said, well, what if, this was in 2000, he said, would Vice President Gore be well advised to choose Senator Bayh as his running mate? And Gramm thought for a moment, he said, well, he could do worse, probably will.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
You were going to ask me about a race in our state.
Senator Lugar is running for re-election in your state, and he is a challenger who has some Tea Party support. And it looks like Senator Lugar, a well-known moderate who's been in the Senate for many years, has been trailing the Tea Party challenger. If he is to lose, what does this say about the politics right now in your state? And
Well, I'm in a difficult position on this because I consider Senator Lugar to be a friend, and I personally would like to say a lot of good things about him, but my guess is that would be used against him in the election. So, and Mitch would have more insight into the internal Republican process than I would, but I do think this, although it's Mitch's belief that the Tea Party isn't really the driving force behind this in the primary, I do think that our politics is being too defined by both extremes, and the Tea Party would be a big example of that, and that I think is probably an element. And on our side, you see a couple of moderate Democrats were taken out in Pennsylvania, I think, in the primaries recently by the left wing of the Democratic Party. So getting back to your previous question about the president's campaign, the conventional wisdom is that Mr. Romney, when a president has an approval rating below 50%, which this president does for a variety of reasons, largely the economy, the conventional wisdom is that the challenger needs to make it a referendum on the president. Are you happy with the last 4 years? Do you want to change? And so forth. The conventional wisdom also is for the incumbent, you've got to make it a choice, a lot like President Bush did in 2004. The day George W. Bush was reelected president, he only had a 48% job approval. He got 52% of the vote. Why did that happen? He convinced 4% of the American people that although they didn't like the job he was doing, John Kerry would be worse. So you may be seeing some of that script start to play itself out here on the part of the president. I personally would say this, though, and I would subscribe to something Mitch said. What's the point of being president if you can't govern? So one of these people has to reach out and make an overt appeal to independents and loyal members of the other opposition, which says, look, I'm going to run on what I stand for, and you may not agree with all of it, but if I win, I'm going to govern for you, and I hope you'll join with me in moving this country forward. I think you'd see the American people rallying around that kind of appeal. I'm afraid what we're going to see, though, is a pretty negative thing, which is going to make it very, very hard to govern the day after.
may I ask you, Governor Daniels, to address the Senator Lugar's race and what you think it says about the state of the Republican Party if he does lose?
Well, first, I hope he'll win, but if he didn't, I wouldn't overread it. There's so many other variables at play here, and it would be very simplistic to look at it as some sort of a Tea Party phenomenon. The question of age and longevity of service has been raised. I think that's troubling at least as many people as whether he's been sufficiently conservative or not. And and plus, his opponent is a fairly credible person, elected twice statewide. So it doesn't fit the stereotype or the pattern of some of these races you saw in 2010. So I'd just be careful not to overinterpret.
Jessica, can I add one last thing? I mean, with Congress's job approval at, what, 9%, I mean, it used to be that incumbency was a big advantage in being reelected, and there are some tactical advantages in terms of fundraising and some of those sorts of things. But boy, the electorate these days almost assumes that, you know, if you've been there for a long, long period of time, you know, some change might be. There's almost a presumption against people who've been there a long
There's an
period of time.
anti-incumbent mood for sure. May I ask, is
No,
that...
not people who've only been there one term,
I know,
but
not
you know,
these gentlemen.
6 terms maybe.
Are you, is that part of the reason you left? Just the bitterness in...
Yeah, that's a part of it. I'm more of a moderate. It's a hard time to be a moderate in either party in Congress. I'd concluded I was more independent at a time in which party fealty and any deviation from party orthodoxy is viewed as an act of betrayal. You know, I'm constantly struck by the fact that John Kennedy wrote a book. I think he may have won a Pulitzer Prize, didn't he, for Profiles in Courage? Every chapter in that book is about a United States senator who broke with his party or cast a vote against his own self-interest. And many of them went down to defeat. Senators who do that today are treated as pariahs, not held up as examples of courage to be emulated. So that was a part of it, but I also, as you suggested and as Mitch alluded to, had the privilege of serving my state as our chief executive for 8 years, and I just found that in executive capacity I could get a lot more done, and at the end of the day, that's why you ought to go into public service. So it was all those things taken together, and including the fact that my wife informed me that being able to pay for our children's college tuition was not such a bad thing.
Senator Corker, do you think whoever is elected will have the ability to govern given the bitterness and the gridlock and the universality of the use of the filibuster in the Senate, especially right now?
I do. You know, think back to the financial crisis that we had in 2008. The world was going to heck in a handbasket, and you know, as much as people at that time had come to dislike President Bush, as much as people were divided over the war in Iraq, you know, the country, look, if you think the country was incredibly divided, but the nation came together, Congress came together and did some things that candidly saved this country and saved our financial system. And so that was just a few years ago. And yes, I absolutely believe it can happen, and I believe it will happen. And as a matter of fact,
do you need to get rid of the filibuster?
No, filibuster. No, you don't want to do that. I mean, people on both sides of the aisle that have been around know that that would be a big mistake. I mean, you need to drive for consensus in the Senate. The Senate's a place where cooler heads should prevail. It hasn't happened as much recently as it should, but look. I'm running for re-election right now too, and last year, every month, I considered sending every contributor's money back, the entire year. You have to ask yourself, is it worth a grown man's time to serve in the United States Senate the way things are today? I'm 59. I had a very productive life prior to being in the Senate. I could do something else that's very productive and fulfilling, I think, pretty sure. I am optimistic, I believe that we are going to solve our nation's problems. I believe we're going to do it in the next 24 months max, and I am probably more optimistic than I have ever been in that regard because frustrations are so high. I actually think that while our side's frustrated, I've never been in the majority. I've been there 5 years. I think the Democratic side is even more frustrated right now. And I think we're going to come together and we're going to solve our nation's problems. And I know it says please wrap up, so thank you.
Right. He's right.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for being here. Governor Daniels, if he asks, will you be Courtney Love's running mate? Thanks, everyone. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you.
Jessica, thank you.
Thanks to this great panel.